Hi, friends. On this very cracked up Christmas special, I'm going to tell you the best way to get into the lore and hobby of 40k. On the surface, Warhammer is a hugely unapproachable setting, but most of those things that make it unapproachable are in actuality the coolest parts of the coolest franchise ever. The expansive lore, the myriad of awesome characters and factions, the vast creative potential, and of course, the big game itself. So, allow me to extend my freakish hand to you and guide you through your first steps in my favorite hobby. And, of course, this is going to be all of my own opinions on what I think are the best ways to get started, and things that I wish someone had told me when I first started out. There's honestly no correct way to get started, so if you just want to read The End of the Death first, or buy a 5,000 point Apocalypse army, then go for it. But there are certainly things that I think you can do to make getting started easier. But before we go any further, allow me a moment to talk about today's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is a tactical, fast-paced battlefield in the palm of your hand, where you can command champions for a bunch of different iconic Warhammer 40,000 factions. I personally love collecting the champions since a lot of them are iconic Warhammer 40,000 characters. I really just can't wait to get my grubby little hands on Yark and Creed. But so far, the Beast Snagga, Tank Smasher, and Celestian Vindicta are my favorites. Vindicta seems to just destroy everything with her multi-flamers, crazy splash damage, which is badass, and if I have to tell you why a knob on Smash a Squig is cool, I don't think we could be friends. Then, beyond the cool characters, I really like the campaign since they're themed after iconic wars like Indomitus, Octarius, and the Black Crusade, baby! But if you like more competitive things, then the PvP arena would be perfect for you as you face off and rank up against enemy players. And right now, there's a special Grotmas event featuring the Red Gobbo, and they also just launched their first legendary battle pass featuring the coolest dude ever, Marnius Calgar. Whoa! They've also just released the other coolest dude ever, Commander Farsight, and the evil, flawless blade, Haskell Thorn. And the devs are constantly adding fresh new content, new game modes, and cool events. So if that sounds cool to you, be sure to click the link in the description or scan the QR code and command your squad today. And use my code CRACKDUCTICUS to get 10 shards for Creed, 50 Blackstone, and 2,000 coins. Oh, and could you guys also join my guild? I want those special rewards. So, first off, this is a lore channel, so we'll start with the lore. And the lore is probably the most intimidating part of getting into Warhammer. Other than maybe that one rules lawyer asshole who never showers. But regardless, the lore of 40k is massive and spans over hundreds of books. However, this is a lot less intimidating when you realize that the novels are really just fluff. Don't worry, diehard lore guys. I already prepared this for you guys to use on me. Now, when I say that the novels are fluff, I'm not trying to say they aren't important in understanding 40k lore. Of course not. They make up the bulk of 40k lore. But what I am saying is that the codices and core book basically give you all of the most important facts for 40k lore, and then the novels expand on these core concepts in order to flesh out the setting and give perspective on the smaller scale of things. Codices are essentially the encyclopedias of 40k, and, in my opinion, the absolute best way to get a foothold in the lore. They give you the essential information on the factions as well as illustrate what exactly makes said faction cool. Literally every codex I have starts with a little blurb of why you should care about them and collect this army. But this can get expensive, even if you buy the old codices, which is totally fine, they have like 90% of the same lore, and in most cases, more lore than current ones, it would still be pretty damn expensive. And honestly, it would be kind of insane to get a codex for every faction you find interesting. Oops. But luckily, there is a nice little thing called the core rulebook. To me, the easiest way to learn lore is in steps, and the first step should be getting the core rulebook and reading the lore within. People always ask me what the best book to read first, and I always tell them the core book and then the codex of their favorite faction. In my opinion, it's best to pick a faction you like and focus on learning about them. This helps you not get overwhelmed by the many factions who have a ton of lore to each of them. R.I.P. Votan. The core book is a perfect tool for reading a little bit about the factions and the relevant background lore for the setting. Conveniently, the core book has little faction primers for all of the playable factions. These are like a page or so telling you what the faction's all about and what makes them cool. This makes the book perfect for not only giving you an idea of what the setting is, but also giving you a little sampler of each faction so you can see what most appeals to you. And you don't even need the expensive current one. The older edition core rulebooks are a lot cheaper and often offer the same, if not more, information. Alternatively, if the 300 or so page rulebook for nerds is still too scary, I have another quite biased suggestion. And don't worry, Lord Diehards, if you recall, I already prepared this for you guys. But I do truly believe that 40k Lord channels are a great way to get your feet wet in the setting. And I thought this before I had a Lord channel. I'm not kidding when I say that I would not be in this hobby if it weren't for 40k YouTube channels. As a video game brain poisoned high schooler, a 10-minute video talking about how badass some green guys are was a lot more appealing than a 500-page novel from a setting that I didn't even know that I liked yet. Obviously, no YouTube video will ever be as in depth or accurate as the literal actual source material. Not even the King of LordTube Ludens videos can quite get there, but that's not really what they're for. If you're only getting lore from YouTube videos, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. In my eyes, YouTube videos are best served as teasers of sorts. They distill the key points of subjects, often add a bit of personal flavor, and hopefully entertain their viewers. In a similar vein, Lexiconum also gets a lot of flack, but honestly, it's a great resource for quickly getting a bunch of basic information. Which, when you're getting started, is all you really need to start enjoying the setting, or even deciding if you will enjoy the setting. The information on Lexiconum is almost 100% accurate, even if it is a bit shallow in most cases. And also, there's a cited source for everything on there, so you can pretty easily find follow up books if a particular topic piques your interest. And also, that's another pretty huge benefit to online lore sources. It's really easy to find the information that you want to learn about. It is a lot easier to Google something like dreadnoughts than it is to get a Space Marine novel and hope big old gun box kill guy appears. But up to this point, all the suggestions were for learning the foundational lore. To me, casting a wide net at first is good since 1. 40k is the setting best served if you know the basics, and that goes for the novels, the games, and basically everything else. Like, you want to know at least a little bit about the Necrons so that you know how much of a big oh shit moment is when a tomb world awakens in a book, or you want to know the basics on the faction that you're fighting in game so that it can be more cinematic and immersive. And then, the second big benefit of learning about all the basics is that it will help you narrow down to your favorite faction. And that's right, we're back to the codices, baby. Once you pick a faction you like, grab their codex. Again, old ones are good, and from the codex, you'll be able to learn more in-depth information, their rules, and usually some blurbs of notable battles or even timelines for the faction. From those, you can find what types of stories interest you and look up if those events have relevant novels. Or you could just Google whatever faction you like and what good books they have. That also works. The books are great for focusing in on single events, characterizing the factions, showing off cool characters, demonstrating culture and how people act, and of course, telling cool stories. Essentially, the books are the Saving Private Ryans to the World War II textbook that is the codices. But also, here's some novels that I think are just generally good starters if you just want to read a good book and get an idea of the setting. When pressed to just recommend a first novel for 40k, I usually tell people Space Wolf by William King, which may seem like an odd pick, but the story at its core is about a Space Marine aspirant learning about the world of 40k. So in that way, it is really cool to be roughly as knowledgeable as Ragnar, and getting basic information of the setting told to you feels narratively resonant. Also, with as little spoilers as possible, there is a moment in the book that essentially gives flashes of all the factions of 40k, and it's really cool and powerful to get glimpses of the horrors that await. And then, another that I would recommend is Fall Acadia. Again, this may be a weird one since you're kind of starting with the climax, but the Fall Acadia novel itself has a splattering of a bunch of different factions. It portrays most of them in a cool light, and it hits all the beats you'd associate with 40k. Plus, it's essentially the beginning of the new era of 40k, so it's not really starting at the end. But be warned, they do kind of just name drop a lot of factions and characters, so if you're just completely unaware of the setting, you might be a little bit lost. But this can also be a cool thing, is that plants seeds of interest in your mind. It kind of just depends on what kind of reader you are. Finally, though, I think that the Eisenhorn books are also a good start, and this is most people's go to suggestion. Also, potential hot take, but I would absolutely not recommend starting with the Infinite Divine. I see a lot of people saying that this is the best book to start with, but I couldn't disagree more. I think the Infinite Divine is a great book, but a horrible start to the lore because, well, in the simplest terms, the Necrons are fucking weird. Necron culture is just so odd and detached from anything that we have that the book gives a strange perspective of the setting, and they drop a lot of Necron terms that will make no sense to newbies. In addition, the fact that it's more comedy driven will also give a somewhat skewed view of the setting. In the same vein, as much as it pains me to say, Caiaphas Cain also probably isn't a great first novel either. But TLDR for the lore section, read the core book to get a broad view of the setting and to read summaries of the factions. Alternatively, watch YouTube videos, preferably mine, for some great summaries. Then, once you pick a faction you like, read their codex and then novels for more in depth and intimate stories. And then you can continue to branch out to your heart's content. And now, I'll quickly touch on some tips on getting into the hobby and game. I think that all three of these can be a hobby in their own right, but they're definitely at their best when enjoyed alongside each other as they all enhance the setting. For me personally, the lore is essential to the game and vice versa. Knowing the lore makes the games that I play so much more fun since I just imagine these epic battles in the context of the setting, and the game inspires me to learn about cool units that I use or cool units that kicked my ass. For example, when I first got into the hobby, I thought Terminators looked super cool and they just had super cool rules, so I went out to read and learn all about them. Also, a super cool thing and one of my favorite parts of the franchise is that 40k lore is specifically written so that basically all of your battles can make sense and can fit in the actual lore, which is one of the reasons I love 40k so much. It's also one of the reasons that I usually hate Primarch's return to the modern era, but that's another video. Anyways, though, my first tip is to look if you have any local game stores. Every single game store I've been to has demo games available, and most of them also have a community painting station and free models available for you to also try. These are the absolute best ways to try the hobby with no investment other than time and maybe gas. But these aren't completely universal, unfortunately. So, if that isn't an option or you already vibed with the demos, I would then recommend starting slow to see if you even like the hobby in game. I think once you pick the faction you like, it's best to buy a single unit of standard infantry. These are called battle line units, and then some paints, brushes, and other tools that you need. This will give you an idea of if you even like painting and building. Because honestly, if you don't enjoy building a single squad, then you definitely won't like making a bunch of them for an army. And as we're learning to build and paint, fortunately, there are a wealth of online resources that you can pretty easily look up. But if there are absolutely no local game stores at all, honestly, I don't really know what to tell you because without a store, it does become infinitely harder to set up games in general. I suppose you just have to hope that you have good and wealthy friends looking for a new hobby. Also, Tabletop Simulator can be a good thing to try, but I personally don't really like using it, so I can't really talk much on that. Anyways, though, once committed, you theoretically have a single painted squad. And from here, I'd say continue to take it slow so that you don't feel overwhelmed or amass a pile of shame. Remember, this is supposed to be an enjoyable hobby. You don't want to take something fun and turn it into a chore. So usually at this point, a good option is getting a combat patrol for your faction. Some factions have sucky ones, but usually you'll get a good splattering of units at discounted prices, which is pretty nice. If you don't want to do that though, generally you can't go wrong getting another infantry squad, a character unit, and a vehicle. For most armies, a combat patrol or the latter option would get you about 500-ish points, which is honestly the minimum points value I would recommend playing at since anything less just isn't fun in my opinion. Or you can play Kill Team, which is another experience in of itself and is a skirmish game to Warhammer's war game. You focus on little squads and it's less of an investment and it's a pretty fun game. I used to like it more than Big 40k, but lately I've been war game pilled, so kind of up to you. And from there, you're pretty firmly in the hobby and beyond the scope of this beginner video. So, congratulations! You're now officially the nerdiest person at the Christmas party. And before I end this video, here's a few quick-fire tips and warnings about what I see as mishaps when getting started. First off, people will recommend it, but I think that Emperor text to speech is the absolute worst way anyone could ever get into the setting. I'm not saying that the series is bad and nothing against the creator, but it's definitely a series made by a super fan made for other people familiar with the setting. It has a lot of inside jokes for hobby vets, and because of this, it tends to either misportray lore or outright bastardize characters simply because its target audience theoretically knows enough to see the joke. Again, absolutely nothing against Emperor Texas Speech. I just think that it gives a strange perspective of the setting if you're an absolute beginner. Similar to this is why I think meme lore is also a bad idea. Memes are super digestible, but just like Texas Speech, they are usually inside jokes rather than true lore. People seem to think that I hate memes, and maybe it's my fault for not properly articulating myself, but I don't hate memes. Rather, I hate the fact that people often push memes as actual lore since it doesn't do justice to the setting, in my opinion. And honestly, it's a strange dichotomy as the most easily accessible and digestible form of 40k content is also the least factual, whereas the most factual and accurate is often the least approachable. But with that said, another misconception is that 40k lore is completely consistent. 40k is a huge series that focuses on a bunch of factions, far more than most other settings. As such, the lore can often contradict itself, and honestly, it's not even necessarily bad writing, it's just that it's a gargantuan task to get a myriad of authors to not only coordinate, but also to know almost 40 years of lore, retcons and all. Certain elements of 40k are vague or misleading by design. And at the end of the day, it is purpose built to be a setting to make your games make sense, which is honestly super cool. And the next misconception, in my opinion, is kind of just generally not to believe when people say you don't need good tools. I saw this a lot when I was getting started, and I think this mindset hindered my hobby progression for a long while. There is certainly a sentiment that any paint, any tool, any model, etc., is fine for starters. And I don't want to come off as an elitist or anything, but usually if you're using crap, it's gonna feel like crap. When I started, I was using crappy hardware store primer, crappy kindergarten brushes, and crappy paint. This made it so much harder to actually paint well and learn. For example, just switching to an actually good primer instantly made my paint jobs a ton better and more enjoyable since I wasn't fighting the model to get a good layer. A good painter can get good results with poor tools, but as a beginner, I find it best to make it as easy as possible for yourself. And now I'm not necessarily saying that you have to get the most expensive products out there. There is certainly a difference between expensive and high quality, and I'm also not saying that there's no place for cheap tools. I personally do like 90% of my painting with crappy brushes, but I do think that it's best to have good tools since it'll help you focus on improving rather than having to find workarounds for your crappy tools. And here I listed some paints I recommend along with brushes and stuff. But finally, the last and most important misconception is that 40k has one set track on how to enjoy it. It is such an expansive hobby with so many hobbies within that no two people's experiences will be completely the same. So if you only care for certain parts of it or you like to do things a little different, that's totally fine. 40k's sole purpose is for people to enjoy it. You can literally just make shit up if you want to. One of my favorite parts of the setting is that it's built so that homebrews are not only easy to make, but are also easy to make sense within the context of the setting. Just don't go around insisting homebrew lore is real, obviously, or that your theories are fact, and at the same time, don't bully people for their homebrews. I think general respect is important and often lost on the internet. Oh, also, even more important than that stupid point, Space Marine pauldrons aren't supposed to be flush with their neck. They're armor that sits atop the arm and should look like this, not this. This is of the utmost importance, and please don't do it. But yeah, that's my guide on how to get into the awesome setting of Warhammer 40k. It may seem intimidating, but it's honestly not much harder to break into than some other hobbies, and the extra difficulty is well worth it. I truly believe that 40k is the best hobby out there, and as silly as it is to say, it's definitely enriched my life in many ways. And don't forget to check out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, either in the link in the description or this handy QR code. And this video has been a bit experimental as I never wrote a true guide before, so let me know what you think about it in the comments and comment to let me know if you're getting into the hobby and if so, which army do you like? I'd love to read all about it. But anyways, thank you for watching and thank you to all my awesome patrons. You guys are super epic. And as always, please be sure to subscribe and consider sharing to all your super cool intros to 40k. Thanks.